So let's talk through every single Orc unit in Warhammer 40k, and some of their strengths, weaknesses and a rough power level when putting them on the board. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orcs, and in this video taking a look through the entire roster of the Orc army. For each unit talking about what they are, their points to fill them in game, what they bring to the table and how effective they are in doing so, basically rounding up a few strengths, weaknesses, a couple of detachment synergies and an overall power rating for the unit in general, though obviously that does vary depending on army and detachment. Loads to talk about here, so let's go through infantry units, then mounted, then vehicles, then characters in that rough order, and round up every single Orc unit in 40k right now. First up we have the basic boys, a battle line infantry unit and the green heart of every war, grabbing a shooter and chopper and charging down the enemy across the other side of the tabletop. Currently they're 80 points to field 10 of them, or 170 to field 20, and that gets you a bunch of 1 wound models at toughness 5. Nice and cheap and fairly sturdy, as often might be the case with Orcs, just about everything will inflict at least some damage on them, but you will need some focused fire to take down the entire mob and wound them with small arms. For basic troops they have alright damage, mass chopper attacks with AP-1 will make short work of a lot of light infantry, and they can punch up a little bit with a power claw in the unit, and a rocket is a pretty reasonable idea to throw some blast shots against elite infantry as you move up. They've got good OC and their sticky objectives is quite a big thing to sell the unit in its own right. Quite tempting to have one unit at 80 points there to have that on the list, even if it's too pushed on the home objective and then move on. And they've got some pretty strong leader options for the squad. The standard Warboss is really nice. A weird boy could be tempting for a big 20 strong mob to teleport them across the board. And again, for 20 strong units, a Warboss and Pain Boy is a fairly tried and tested combo, giving you a pretty threatening and really quite durable unit with that feel no pain. If it's not already been taken up by fancy boys with bigger weapons, you could use either a truck or battle wagon to get them into the fight. I've seen both of them used for different sizes of Orc mob. And being the central troops choice of the army, most attachments give them at least something useful. They're certainly solid enough for Warhorde. Bully Boys could make them better with a boss in the unit, and they're a central unit for Green Tide, with a whole suite of stratagems and a detachment rule all ready to try and support them as a Horde army. For their downsides, they are potentially a little bit on the slow side if foot slogging. Their damage is slanted towards lighter infantry, and they're not going to do too much against things that are high save or high toughness. And as mentioned, their defense does have the downside of being able to take a lot of incidental damage from random melee attacks and small arms, and they're not quite as cheap after you've invested transports and leaders for them. For transported damage dealer style units, they've got lots of competition from say Beast Snagger Boys, Knobs or Breaker Boys. And within the unit it's maybe a bit disappointing to still see shooters suboptimal. I think it's maybe kind of telling that even in pre-nerf Mordaka, people still tended to opt for Chopper and Slugger. Shooty Boys just really aren't all that strong at the moment. They're still a really good unit for the Orcs though. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Even if not building around them, one copy of the unit for sticky objectives definitely isn't an awful choice. Next up we've got the Beast Snagger Boys, 95 points for a similar sort of battle line infantry unit, these guys being the more sort of savage or beast hunters. These cost more at 95 points for 10 of them, or 190 for 20. The vast majority of people field them in 10s. Compared with the regular boys, they get an extra pip of strength, going up to strength 5 or up to strength 6 in the war, which is really quite a nice breakpoint. They've got inbuilt rerolls that help them out against tough stuff like monsters and vehicles, and those rerolls confer to the beast boss that might be leading them. Plus they've got the good OC and a 6+ feel no pain built in for a little bit more durability than the regular boys. They're one of the few units that can be transported in kill rigs, which are a pretty efficient data sheet for their all-round stats and damage and defense for 155 points, and they're pretty powerful with the melee boost of Warhorde, and the Big Hunt has a bunch of focal stratagems and support for Beast Snaggers in general. For downsides, they're locked to just a few character choices, and only one that's really considered strong, though the Beast Boss is a really good leader. With him and these guys, they can blend both light infantry and heavy vehicles. Their defense per point is a bit weaker than boys on average, when you account for the fact they cost a fair bit more. The Feel No Pain doesn't quite trade out against that, and certainly doesn't at all against anything with damage 2 or higher, and they do lack the sticky objectives rule, which is quite a nice utility thing to have on the main unit. Alongside a Beast Boss though, they're a really popular and common unit to have jumping out of trucks or kill rigs or things to get stuck into the enemy and lay low the biggest and nastiest enemy vehicles and monsters. Again, I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Next up, as ever, boys might win fights, but grots win games. The diminutive Gretchen costs 40 points per unit of 11 of them, including the Runt Herd, or 80 points to double up that number. 40-point tiny investment units are really super easy to include in a list and have a lot of utility. They can do actions, they can screen areas of the board, they've got quite a good footprint, and they've got a surprising amount of OC for that cost, even if it's on very fragile bodies. The opponent will actually have to kill the unit as they're a big 21 OC at base. Occasionally they might do some actual damage with the grot blasters, but that's not really their role. And they've got a few detachment synergies, such as being able to spam loads of them in Dread Mob if you want a crazy grot horde, or you could do fun things with Zodgrod Wartsnagger, being able to scout them up the board. They'll feel like their biggest advantage is the fact that they can farm some command points on a 4+ on an objective. That's pretty great for a cheap utility unit that can do a bit of grunt work along the way. 1 unit for a home field objective is absolutely auto-include. It seems the sweet spot for a whole bunch of Ork lists is to include 2 units for 80 points total. And if just about every faction in Warhammer 40k could access this sort of thing, then they absolutely would get used in small numbers. Obviously they're not meant to be mainline damage dealers or anything. Small arms kill them fast, and there's maybe some diminishing returns if you have multiple units of them, as the first squad just has excess value to farm command points all game long. Either way though, it doesn't really get too much more efficient than a 40-point unit that can potentially generate a whole bunch of command points over the game. I've chosen to give them at the full 10 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Burner Boys. These guys are Orks with flamethrowers, using their cutting flames to chop up scrap for the mechs. 60 points per unit of 5 of them, or 120 per 10, and you get a mech in the unit as well who can take a rocket or a custom Mega Blaster. They have a whole bunch of flamer attacks, which are quite nice versus light infantry, and alright in Overwatch. The damage gets a fair bit better against things on objectives, with re-rolling the wound rolls. As the Orks, they still have okay melee, and it's acceptably good with AP2 with the cutting flames, and it feels like a unit that I've seen used quite a lot in small units to go in transport, along with something fightier. Maybe 5 knobs and a Warboss or a Flash Gits unit or something, and if you can't quite stretch to a high investment unit to add into a truck alongside, then some Burner Boys could be a good choice to run along and be quite efficient helping them out. Compared with most other Orky units, they feel like they don't really have quite so many good synergies, say versus Dread Mob with Looters, and they're not really a unit that ever needs leaders particularly. They maybe have some competition with other units like Flash Gits, bringing a bit more overall threat per slot in a transport, but overall I feel like they're fairly reasonable and effective, not all that expensive. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. Next up we've got the Looters, boy bodies that are 10 points per in their small 5 squad unit. The big squad now pays a premium for 115 points, and this gives you a bunch of Orks with Def Guns with their Strength 8 and Damage 2 profiles, plus a couple of mechs. They fire out 2 shots to 48-inch range or 3 shots to 24 inches. They only hit on a 6+, but with a heavy keyword, and re-roll hit rolls against things on objective markers, making them significantly better there. They're strongest in Dread Mob with mech leaders, allowing them some nice lethal hits or sustained hits combos, and are quite nice in Tactical Brigade as well, where they can get the +1 to hit order. And it's fairly common to see them in multiple 10-strong units in either of those, maybe backed up by mechs with shock attack guns. For their downsides, the damage does have some big weaknesses. High saves, high toughness, and -1 damage could all cause problems. They're not going to light things in cover quite so much, and if they either have to move or can't shoot at things on objectives, all of these could be barriers to their damage output really going off. They are quite detachment specific as well. Dread Mob and Tactical are just far better than the other ones, amplifying their damage in a really big way, and they're just not really very viable outside of that. It was a bit painful for them that the strongest way to field them with the largest squad of 10 was nerfed to 115 points. I'm really not sure why that was the case, as it didn't seem that they were overpowered by any stretch of the imagination. That is unfortunate, as that was the way they were often fielded in Dread Mob and Tactical Brigade. Overall, in the light of those recent slightly painful points nerfs, I've given them a 7 out of 10. In reality, maybe a little bit higher than this in their dedicated detachments, where they're going to be central units, but probably lower than this elsewhere. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Tech and their Mechi carry cases. They're one rather different option for storing and transporting miniatures. These things do model transport a bit different to most things out there, having their component system, where they basically have a bunch of clever contraptions that can grip onto miniature bases, some being spring-loaded to hold on to individual ones, some lever-operated ones with some rubber gripping arms to hold on to entire squads at once, and other features for holding tanks and monsters. They have a whole bunch of different options for carry cases linked down in the video description below. These ones are their standard slider cases, more focused on practical miniature transport, and you can mount a variety of those different modules inside depending on your needs. They do have options like this great big carry case here that can go all the way up to things that can store a 2,000 point army. You can see a pretty massive Crimson Fist force hanging out in this one. You can check them out, linked down in the video description if you want to take a look over their stuff. They've got a live web chat thing for advice on cases and things. They gave me a 10% Auspex discount code if you do happen to pick anything up. If you're interested about them, I'll talk through a few pros, cons, and some of their specific models at the end of the video. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one though. Moving on, and next up we have the Tank Busters, 140 points per unit of 6 of them for the Orks with the big rockets that like to bring down the biggest and chunkiest vehicles around. They've certainly been a staple in Orky army lists since their recent datasheet came out, and have fairly general purpose shooting at a whole barrage of strength 9, damage 3 attacks, getting D3 shots with blast, which makes them quite effective against medium infantry, a +1/2 hit and wound against vehicles that makes them good against tough targets, and once became AP3 from a pulsar rocket, and bomb squigs can also add extra damage into the mix as well. They can generally make their presence felt in quite a big way for trucks to transport them to get them in range, and they could specifically enjoy Tactical Brigade, where they could know that they're getting a +1 to hit against infantry units as well, and if investing in a mech to lead them, they might like Dread Mob or Mordaka as well. They recently had a points rise to 140 points from 135, which was up on the previous as well. They now feel like they're getting rather fragile for the points, for 2 wounds at toughness 5 and a 4+ save. That's really not a lot for 23 points worth of model. I feel like the recent points changes maybe have made them to be just that bit less standout. I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10 overall. They still seem really quite playable and a solid unit. They just feel a touch less auto-include at that higher points cost to me. Their variant build are the Breaker Boys. They're also 140 points per 6 of them. They're an infantry unit in Warhammer 40k that can absolutely break tanks and vehicles, and will have a good shot at everything else as well. Big hitting damage 3 attacks with their smash hammers with anti-tank and anti-monster. They do have quite a low number of attacks, but that does also mean that they get an enormous damage increase in the war, going up to 3 each. They also get 2 bonus bomb squigs as well. They can reroll charges just built in. They're another really good option to get loads of fighting power inside trucks, doing more damage per slot versus same knobs. They could be led by a Warboss as well if desired, and they'll enjoy Warhorde, fully sustained hits and good stratagem support. For downsides, I feel like they'd be compared to knobs. They do generally hit things a bit harder with those damage 3 profiles than knobs depending on the targets, but they will also be more fragile as well, as the knobs get a -1 to wound when a Warboss is around. As slow-moving infantry that are really quite fragile, they certainly need transport delivery and investment in them. If they can't get into their ideal targets, they might fall a bit flat against hordes, and they won't stand out against enemies with high saves and armour of contempt either. So it definitely feels like there's going to be situations where they can trade out badly. I still say they're a very strong unit, and particularly in Warhorde, which is really strong at the moment. I've also chosen to give them an 8 out of 10. It does seem they're able to make their way into plenty of Warhorde lists, often alongside Warbosses. Next up, we've got the Nob Squad. The Orky Elites, 105 points for 5 or 210 per 10. Often some of the biggest and meanest around with big melee damage to match. For that cost, you get a fighting retinue for an Orc Warboss, mass strength 9, AP -2 and damage 2 power claw attacks, boosted in the war to strength 10, which is quite a meaningful breakpoint for them. And they enjoy being with a Warboss in the same unit, as he gives them -1 to wound, as well as the +1 to hit, which is really meaningful on the power claw 4+. That durability rule helps make them a little bit tougher to take down versus, say, the Breaker Boys. They still aren't particularly hard to kill versus many. Heavy bolter equivalents are going to have a good time into them, but between them and a Warboss, they can be an effective fighter unit that can rip down a bunch of the toughest stuff in the enemy army, just burying them under mass damage 2 attacks. I quite like Warhorde with the sustained hits, and maybe tempted to go for the sustained hits on a 5+ stratagem, and Bully Boys has them as one of the focal units as well. Anything that could give them lethal hits nearby could be rather nice too, such as Makari with Gazgul. For their weaknesses, durability on the strike back is definitely a big issue. Strength 9 to strength 10 does have some targets they'll do badly against. Things like -1 damage or toughness 11 or more really won't be good for them. And for killing heavy stuff, they do have competition from both Breaker Boys and Beast Snaggers with a Beast Boss, both of which will probably do better into monster and vehicle targets compared with them. They'll generally have the upper hand against medium infantry though with those profiles, and they are a strong unit for one of the best Orc detachments. I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10 here. For their counterparts in big looted scrap armour, we've got the Mega Knobs. They're 35 points each, and you can field them anywhere between 2s to 6s besides squads of 4. They are a notably fairly tough unit to take down. 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 2+ save is very sturdy, and they get far tougher in the war with a 5+ feel no pain, meaning that they can tank a lot of damage in those turns. I feel that for most armies, perhaps their strongest use is for a small bodyguard to Gazgul Thracker, particularly as they're needed to trigger his big melee buff rule for the +1 to hit and wound. And maybe seen a little bit pricey otherwise, unless you have the detachment that focuses on them in the Bully Boys. They can do some damage with the kill saws, which will be nice against tough targets, but they don't have a very high volume attacks for their points cost, which can leave them surprisingly ineffective against units that have quite a lot of models. Bully Boys does give them some good support though, including the double war that allows them extra damage and also 2 turns of that rather good feel no pain. plus some other good supporting stratagems such as Orky Armour of Contempt and some damage dealer style ones, and also that enhancement that can allow them to teleport in. It's quite nice they can still use trucks to get them into the fight as well, not being locked out of them due to wearing heavier armour, unlike say the Space Marines. The main downsides are perhaps being rather slow on the board. As mentioned, melee attacks that aren't really all that versatile, and for their overall damage and defence I feel they're more in the region of being fairly costed as opposed to stand out for the Orks. I've chosen to give them a 7 out of 10 here, though I'd rank them higher than this in Bully Boys. Next up we've got the Flash Kit, 80 points for 5 of them or 170 points per 10. They're the Orks with the big guns and more Dakka, shooting out mass strength 6 damage 2 attacks, ideally at close range for their further shooting buff, getting a single turn of lethal hits, and then they can also follow that up with some surprisingly effective melee with mass strength 5, AP 1 and damage 1. Between those two there's a pretty good chance they can trade up into a whole bunch of infantry units, often jumping out of a truck, and having just 5 models in the units means that they could go alongside say units of 6 with a leader, so perhaps accompanying some Breaker Boys or something. For the 16 points their durability is alright, still not standout, and for detachment synergies they're far more interesting in Tactical Brigade versus elsewhere. Getting a mech captain to join them, maybe for a custom force field 4+ invulnerable save, and then hitting on a 4+ with rerolls, that takes them up from being a fairly scary unit to a standout scary one. For their downsides, their damage output just won't really worry certain units all that much, not unless it's buffed up with mech captain, and even then certain big tough units with a 2+ save might well shrug off a good chunk of it. Outside that detachment, most characters can't join them, and the larger squad going up in points was kind of unhelpful, a very direct nerf to one of the stronger ways to field them. I still rate them as a strong unit overall though. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10, both good as a small unit to skirmish out of trucks and in the big combo form. Moving on, and next up we have the Storm Boys. They're an infantry unit with fly, orcs strapping rocket packs to their backs and hurtling through the air in regimented fashion. They're 65 points for 5 of them, 130 for 10, and have basic boys profiles with vastly better movement and able to advance and charge, so can threaten charges really quite a long way away. In general they tend to have their role as the preferred Orky units to do secondary objectives, often taken as 1 or 2 units of 5 in a whole load of lists, not literally 100% auto-include, but more tend to take them than not. Their damage output with their choppers is still adequately capable of skirmishing with lighter infantry, and power claws can help them punch up a little bit against other stuff, and they're a little bit more standout than otherwise in Tactical Brigade, getting battle line and a few specific stratagem advantages, though in general you'd still not really want to spam them there I think. For their downsides, they do pay an expected premium for their very good speed and deep strike, a big +5 points on regular boys in smaller squads for very similar stats. They don't have any leader choices, with the loss of Boss Zagstruck, which maybe hurts them as a more damage dealing role. In general though, if you want Orks to be dedicated secondary objective doers, they can do that, and quite efficiently. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 overall, though that's more for using 1 or 2 units in an army list, adding directly to the whole idea of playing the mission. Next up we've got their Bloodaxe brothers in the Commandos. They're 120 points for a squad of 10, the sneaky Ork infiltrators, using cunning and tactics to get the jump on the enemy. Having the infiltrate keyword definitely makes them interesting. They're one of just 2 options that can do so, alongside Boss Snickrot, and infiltrators do have some value all of their own in Warhammer 40k. Just having one unit can stop the enemy from putting down their infiltrators where they want to, or screen off their scout moves, plus being in position to turn 1 claim mid-board objectives, do first turn secondaries or nuisance charges or move blocks, or even with a whole bunch of chopper attacks to charge down enemy units they might have a good enough damage profile into. They do have a bit of fun special gear as well, with a breacher ram, a rocket, a bomb squig, a distraction grot and a claw on the boss, so when they eventually engage they could take a chunk out of tougher stuff as well. They also have the data sheet rule allowing them not to be able to be overwatched, and have a few things that they can do differently in the Tactical Brigade, such as that enhancement for having a boss able to join them. For their main weaknesses, they are quite a pricey unit, 120 points and paying an expected premium for their infiltrate rules, so even with that 120 points is quite a big ask. Infiltrate units often just more tempting to have in smaller squads, as you can get a lot of the same utility just from having any squad up there, even if it's not a big one, and they'd definitely be stronger and more efficient in a 5-man unit if they are able to take that. As a result, some lists take them, but a whole load of lists pass them up as they're just a big investment. I've chosen to give them a 7.5 out of 10 here. They are an infiltrate squad that can add some good utility, and with a pressure army, adding immediate pressure turn 1 to the enemy with commandos is definitely a bonus, but they certainly pay a lot for the privilege. Next up, we've got the Orky Cavalry that are the Squighog Boys. They got a recent points decrease, so it's now 150 points for 4 of them, or 300 for 8, and that gets you a really quite chunky cavalry unit. 3 wounds each and 4 wounds for the knob, all at toughness 7, a 4+ save and a 5+ feel no pain, which I'd describe as adequately sturdy for that points cost, and they could be a good choice for the -1 to wound stratagem in Warhorde, which makes them a big pain to take down for big scary anti-tank guns focused on them. They're at least somewhat fast with a 10-inch move and re-rolling advances and charges inbuilt into the datasheets. Their damage output is fairly general purpose given the anti-keywords on their weapons, and a little bit of shooting and bomb squig damage, and between all of this they create a unit that the opponent generally has to think about or deal with, either absorbing quite a lot of damage or having to expend units to get in the way of them, unless they want a fairly big damage charge against them. They also are focal units for their big hunt, with a bunch of stratagems and options that work better on them than most things. They're pretty great units for charging and destroying the prey. For weaknesses though, their mounted keyword is a downside, meaning they need to go around terrain and that can slow their advance quite a bit up the board. Having a huge unit footprint isn't ideal, as it's going to make them easier to draw line of sight on and a bit unwieldy to get all their models into combat, and maybe making them even easier to screen or move block. AP1 on their weapons can have problems against certain tough units, 2+ save units or armies with armor of contempt, or both could all be quite bad for them, and having their best detachment be big hunts isn't exactly one of the best things in the world, given it's considered to be one of the less strong detachments. They are a big, tough and fairly dangerous unit that's pretty easy to use and are fairly sturdy, and between all that I've given them a 7 out of 10. I would say that they're going to be better in casual games or big hunt, and probably not all that often seen in competitive, even at the lower points cost I guess, but certainly not an unusable unit, and I do quite like their models. Next up we've got Warbikers, 70 points per unit of 3 of them, 140 per squad of 6. Again, they've got a solid defense with 3 or 4 wounds at toughness 6 and a 4+ save, quite good for the points cost. They move fast with a 12-inch move, and if they can get their sights on light infantry, they're not too bad for damage dealing against them. Between their choppers and their dagger gun attacks, they can be a nice cheap option for doing secondary objectives and skirmishing, maybe rivaling Stormboys for that role. For their downsides, the damage output just isn't really very general purpose for them, and the Power Claw only helps so much with that. Stormboys are generally preferred to them as a utility unit, as they're going to be able to deep strike in, and their fast movement doesn't care about having to go around terrain, and between those two they remain kind of niche. I think they're usable enough for their stats, but for a utility role they're usually going to get outcompeted by Stormboys, and for a damage role they're going to be outcompeted by other stuff. They're still not unusable for either purpose though, and if you did want to make Cult of Speed work, then they gain quite a lot from that detachment. Outside of that though, they feel kind of niche. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 here, though I'd rate them a bit better in Cult of Speed. Sticking with the speed freaks, and next up we have the Deathcopters. They're 80 points per 3 or 160 per 6. They had quite a solid recent points cut that does make them a fair bit more efficient in my opinion. Despite in the past having jetbike style rules, they're technically a vehicle unit now. They're fairly sturdy for the points cost at 4 wounds at toughness 6. They also can move fast and can deep strike. Could be an interesting enough utility unit to rival Stormboys that have a whole bunch more stats and have at least a reasonable amount of damage threat, a bunch of copter rockets and some spinning blades, plus a few flyby mortal wound attacks. They don't really feel like they particularly stand out in any one area, but put that all together and they can do an alright amount of damage, particularly against lighter stuff. They do have some downsides though. No leader choices, again the best attachment that gives them stuff being the Cult of Speed. Maybe a bit of a confused unit that doesn't really have any one clear role. And if they're going for the utility role, then cheaper 65 point Stormboys might be more tempting for some at least. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. I feel like they're looking solidly better than pre-points cut. And between speed, damage, defense and utility, they definitely have a fair bit going on for 80 points. Next up, we've got the Orky artillery of the Mech guns. They're 50 points each, and that gets you a little artillery vehicle unit, 6 wounds at toughness 5, and then have a choice of different weapons, maybe these smasher guns being the most general purpose and popular. D3 plus 1 shots at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3. The custom mega cannons might be the other more interesting one, though rather let down by their AP 1. They might enjoy the Dread Mob buffs for a little bit more scary firepower in that detachment. They can reroll hit rolls of 1 against things that aren't monsters and vehicles, provided those units are at starting strength, so nice for an initial salvo there, and they could be joined by a mech of some sort for enhancements, though in general I feel like there's not really much incentive to. For their downsides, the 3-inch movement that they have means that they just won't be able to reposition for lines of sight very well. They're pretty easy to hide from if desired. For Orky firepower, they're competing with tank busters for a similar sort of firepower niche, and tank busters in general will be able to move around the board a fair bit better. Their damage output is quite similar, even if they don't have quite as much durability in the squad. though even then the durability of the mech guns isn't exactly crazy standout. Both anti-tank and small arms will be able to take chunks out of them with toughness 5 and a 5+ save. Overall feels like they're not awful if you want a little bit of ranged fire support to sit in the backfield, and they could be a cheap screening unit to do that while contributing to the game. Though in general I feel like they're a bit underwhelming for their firepower for the cost, maybe outside of Dread Mob potentially. I've chosen to give them a 6.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Ork transport and delivery system that is the truck. Mechanised Orky armies certainly having come into their own in 10th edition. Unfortunately, they got another points rise recently, going up to 70 points for the unit, though I still feel that won't stop them from being popular and necessary. There's just so many Ork units that are really quite dangerous, want to get in close, but also don't have great armour saves and move slowly if they're on the board. And transports help with all of those problems. Even if units are getting out of them straight away, that's an extra plus 3 inches to their threat range from disembarking out the front of it. You can potentially make use of them with multiple units doing shenanigans like one unit jumps out and then the next unit jumps in to set up for their strike. For firepower units, you can fire things out of their firing deck, which might make more sense at certain times if it doesn't make sense to make use of the unit's damage rule that wouldn't function in the truck. The durability is fairly good for 70 points even after the points rise. 10 wounds at toughness 8 with a 4+ save and a 6+ invulnerable is alright, and they slowly regenerate wounds. Once they're done transporting, they can be a nuisance in their own right as well. Nuisance charging enemy units, they could do tank shock, or maybe contributing to objectives if they're in a position to do so. I guess for weaknesses, they don't exactly do damage output, that's not really their role, and they are less efficient than they used to be after successive points rises. I still guess that they're going to be the transport of choice for most Orky units out there, being able to get the job done in the same way as a battle wagon would, but cost far less. I've chosen to give them a 9 out of 10 here. I still feel like mechanised Orks with a bunch of violence jumping out of transports isn't going to be going away anytime soon. Talking of other bigger and chunkier transports though, next up we have the Battle Wagon, 160 points for the premium transport of the Orks. For this one you get 16 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save, and a built-in rule worsening enemy AP, which could be pretty nice stacked with cover as well, making these things pretty significantly hard to take down. If you take the Ard case and lose the firing deck, they go up to toughness 12 as well, making them a lot tougher against certain anti-tank weapons like las cannons. And inside the hold they've got a big transport capacity, enough for 20 strong boys mobs with attached characters, or multiple smaller units. Again, they could be a scary staging post that can roll up the board and then have whatever Orks jump out of it directly into the enemy lines. It has a bit of firepower as well, and a bit of melee threat in its own right with the Death Roller and potentially other add-ons if you choose to stick them on. For weaknesses, maybe the main downside is competition with cheaper trucks that can still transport just about everything the Battle Wagon can. There's only a few targets that can go in a wagon but not in a truck, and otherwise in its own right its durability is fairly standout, its damage output less so. Overall rated as a solidly usable unit, though perhaps a bit dependent on having the units that you want to transport in it. 20 strong boys mobs maybe being the biggest and most obvious one. Definitely still usable otherwise though, and maybe gaining more ground on the truck given that that one went up in points and this guy didn't. Overall I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Moving on, and next up we've got the Kill Rig. Pretty much the Beast Snagger Battle Wagon, 155 points for a great big transport, gun rig and psycho tower, and these things have just got scary general purpose stats all the way around. Pretty good defense with 16 wounds at toughness 10 and a 6+ feel no pain. That's usually going to take at least a fair bit of focus fire to get rid of. They've got a solid vehicle busting whir tower that's really quite strong for Overwatch given that it's got torrent rules, and nice to have just some guaranteed hits with anti-tank profiles on enemy vehicles where you need them. Its melee damage is pretty threatening in its own right, fairly nicely general purpose between saw blades, horns and butcher boys, and its special rule can hand out lethal hits, potentially helping its own profiles get stuck in when the time comes. For its transport capacity, it is more limited than some, only being able to take Beast Snagger boys and Beast bosses into the fight. That's certainly enough to make it well worth it. They're a pretty scary and general purpose unit. Finally, it's got a tiny bit of extra firepower hitting on 5+, though if it does land a shot with its sticker against nearby monster and vehicles, you can make its own charge that bit easier as well. It does feel like it's a whole bunch of value for the 155 points cost, and they are quite easy to use. Maybe for weaknesses, I'd say that the toughness is solid enough, but not quite so solid that it can usually handle the focus fire from dedicated anti-tank that it's going to attract if it moves forward. Even with the big wounds characteristic, strength 10 and a 3+ save with no invulnerable save isn't the best mix in the world, and it will have competition with trucks to get those guys from A to B for a cheaper cost. Overall though, I'd certainly rate the kill rig as a strong unit. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. It does quite a lot for the cost. It might be one of the units that just has outsized value in more casual metas, perhaps being extra strong and easy to use there, or still being a solidly competitive unit, but not one that literally every single army takes them up on. For its counterpart, we've got the Hunter rig. This one's the transport version of the kill rig, 135 points, so 20 points cheaper, and this one has the big boosted transport capacity of 21 models, effectively being tougher for the cost as you get the same profile as the kill rig, but it costs less points. Similar melee damage to the kill rig, again for fewer points, and you can get a few more attacks with the Butcher Boys if it has models embarked within it. In general though, this one just really isn't all that efficient compared with the kill rig. For only 20 points less, you may as well pay that and get the Word Tower upgrade. That's almost guarantees to add enough extra value in its own right, never mind the lethal hits buff, which is also pretty nice as well. And in general, people don't usually tend to field beast snaggers in 20s. 10 with a boss is absolutely fine to wreck the majority of targets. Overall, I'd say it's not awful, but behind the kill rig, I've given it a 6 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Orky Buggies, which have consolidated into just the one slide here. I feel like these things have more similarities than differences, maybe more feeling like war gear loadouts. Most are either 70 or 75 points, besides the Squig Buggy that's up at 95. Games Workshop put them all down in points recently, and they aren't awful on the defensive front. 9 wounds at toughness 7 with a 4+ save and a 6+ invulnerable save, though it is perhaps a profile that everything is generally quite good at dealing damage against, small arms taking chunks out of them. Special weapons finding them an extra good target, and anti-tank doing fine as well. As you expect, the buggies move fairly fast at a 12-inch move, and they do have a small melee threat as well, a bunch of attacks at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2. Then beyond that, they all have their own specifics. The Shock Jump Dragster can warp around the board, allowing you to jump around for secondary objectives, and has a little bit of precision firepower. The Squig Buggy has a tiny amount of indirect fire, though often hitting on a 6 if so, a chance to slow down an enemy unit and a mortal wound mine. The Megatrak Scrapjet is 75 points for around about 5 to 6 rocket shots on average, plus some twin big shooters, and it gets some mortal wound impact hits on the charge to up its melee threat. The Custom Booster Blaster puts out strength 8 and damage 2 hits, some close range torrents, and can make units -1 to hit. And finally, the Boomdacker Snazwagon gets a bunch of strength 5 damage 1 shooting, and that debuffs hit rolls if you're close to it. I think the main issue with these guys is they just don't really have all that much damage output for their points cost. It's perhaps not crazily behind the curve now they all went down in points a little bit, but still even the better ones aren't really all that impressive, and they're a bit cumbersome with really quite big models with big bases that just don't really have all that much damage or defense for the amount of space they take up on the board. So it could cause some traffic jams up close, or screen each other if you say wanted to use multiple of them in tandem to all get into an enemy unit or something. I guess maybe you could use isolated ones for pushing onto an objective and then being at least a somewhat tough unit for its points cost when you get there. Basically using their speed and toughness and just accepting that they won't do all that much damage really, and have them as expendable things, but there's plenty of other options in the Ork army that could do that. If that's all you want, then trucks could do a very similar sort of job while also transporting scary stuff. With their current profiles, they need to rely on cult of speed to be some way strong, but unfortunately that detachment is not really considered to be one of the better ones, even in the light of them getting the advanced shoot and charge thing going on. I just feel like these guys are going to unlikely to be a good unit until they get to ridiculously low standout points cost. In general, it feels like they might need more of a datasheet boost as opposed to cheaper points. Just for a rough average, I've given them a 5.5 out of 10 here. I'd say most of them have at least some interesting utility, probably least convinced by the Squig Buggy. Maybe it depends on the type of firepower that you want to add to the army, and the Dragster's interesting enough for teleporting around the board, which could be alright for secondaries. They might struggle to land in place compared with small Stormboy units. Next up, for perhaps the other major neglected class of Ork vehicles, we've got the Aircraft, with 115 points to 175 points depending on variant taken. And for that you get toughness 9 planes with 12 wounds, a 3+ save and a 6+ invulnerable, so sort of going from middling to bad durability depending on the points cost. As aircraft, without hover they have to start off the board, so they'll be turning up turn 2, and for positives they might be able to draw unusual lines of sight as they ignore the obscuring ruin style rules, and that could allow you to hit some things that would otherwise be safe. They're speed freaks with some synergies with the cult of speed. The Dakajet in particular could have some alright firepower with lethal sustained on a 5+ for 1 command point in Cult of Speed. I'd probably rate that one as my favourite one, otherwise the Wazbomb Blaster Jet of the mech plane. Get some boosted damage profiles matched on it, so at least you can threaten Space Marines and heavy infantry and things. It does get a 4+ invulnerable save as well, though it is the most expensive one at 175 points, so it's still not very standout for the cost at all. 4 downsides, basically being an aircraft in 40k 10th edition guarantees they're not really going to be very good. Games Workshop doesn't balance them when they're bad. So basically they've been really weak all edition and look likely to stay weak. The 10th aircraft rules are truly horrendous for bombers as well, only being able to turn up turn 2, so the earliest that you could bomb would be turn 3 normally, and your opponent might be able to move out the way if they care, which they might well not do as they aren't really all that dangerous bombs in the first place. They're not particularly tough and they can't hide behind ruins in the same way as things can't hide from them, so that means that if the opponent's got any long-range anti-tank they should be fairly easy prey. And again, the Cult of Speeds being one of the best places to run them, it doesn't really do them huge amounts of favours, as that detachment still isn't one of the most powerful. Overall, maybe stretched to a 4 or 5 out of 10 for the Dakka Jet specifically, the WAS bomb being around about that level as well, and the bombers probably far below, more like 1 or 2ish. Let's move on to some big and stompy Ork Walkers next though. Next up we have the Death Dread for 120 points. That gets you an 8 wounds toughness 9 walker with a 2+ save, and really quite a flexible loadout depending on whether or not you want to spec it for melee combat or shooting. Potentially 7 attacks at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3 if you'd like, or keeping 4 of those attacks and giving it 3 ranged weapons. Usually I'd say it makes sense to give at least 1 melee weapon though, as that's got outsized value to add 4 of those punchy attacks with. This one unfortunately just does seem a bit underpowered in anywhere besides Dread Mob. Its defense isn't particularly standout at 120 points for the 8 wound profile, even if they are fairly hard to take down. Being a not particularly fast moving vehicle unit, it's likely to have to wander around the edges of ruins and take a bunch of shots before it actually makes melee, or gets into the stuff that it really wants to, and that's probably not going to be good news for that kind of profile. The damage output just really isn't great either, maybe having most hope at being somewhat scary in Dread Mob where you can get some pretty interesting shooting buffs. Even there though, for stronger Dread Mob lists, you rarely see people even using these, which is quite telling given just how powerful the buffs are to its shooting, and it still doesn't seem to be viable there. Quite a weak datasheet rule doesn't really help it either. It's got the chance to inflict battle shock in the fight phase, which might do something occasionally to prevent stratagems, but again usually battle shock style rules aren't exactly a positive here. I think overall it either needs to do more or have a fairly significantly lower points cost, as I feel like it's outcompeted by the other Orky Walkers at the moment, never mind the fact that they aren't exactly considered big meta staples or anything. I've given it a 4.5 out of 10 here. Next up we've got the Killer Cans, Cowardly Gretchen wired into small stompy walkers with some big rockets and buzzing saw blades. There are 125 points between a unit of 3 to 6 of them. Durability being kind of alright at those points. 5 wounds at toughness 6 for a 3+ save isn't terrible for 41 points. Still not exactly hugely stand out though. They've got some somewhat accurate rocket fire that hits on a 4+ with multiple copies of blast, and there are plenty of other weapon options available if they are preferred. Their melee is fairly nice against enemy elites with a damage 3, and again will benefit most from the Dread Mob buffs compared with others. Both the rockets and their melee can do rather well with Dread Mob buffs if you do want to build around Orky Walkers, and bigger units of them can be a fair bit more efficient for stratagems compared with Death Dreads. Again though, they feel like a unit that's really suffering for Dread Mob having some powerful core rules. Maybe Games Workshop nervous to decrease the points cost on any of these despite them not really being very efficient outside of it. And again, like the Death Dreads, they feel like a unit that's one of the more obvious go-tos, maybe for slightly more casual Dread Mob lists, but for top placing ones, again, I've seen very little ones actually use killer cans for them. Instead, maybe building around bigger walkers and things like mech combos with looters. Again, seeing as they're having so much limited success, even in the detachment that in theory should be made for them. Certainly feels that they could do with a points cut or some beefed up abilities, and they do have a couple of other weaknesses as well, such as a special rule that's about as likely to harm them as it helps anyone else. Occasionally it might well make sense to roll on it if you've got a super ideal target and a unit of 6, but often just a chance to take d6 mortal wounds is definitely not going to be worth it, and they do have low leadership as well, which might occasionally cause issues. Perhaps not ideal in a unit that might well be scrapping for the midboard. I rate them a bit better than Death Dreads for raw power for points though. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here. Next up we've got the Gorkanaut and Morkanaut. They're Titanic and towering vehicle units, the Gorkanaut at 265 points, and they have some pretty intimidating beefy stat lines, 20 wounds at toughness 12 with a 3+ save, so at least need a fair bit of focus fire to take them down, and while they are quite big investments, it's not necessarily game over if you lose one. They don't have the best movement in the world, going 8 inches per turn, but they can move over models and bash through bits of terrain that are less than 4 inches in height. They both have intimidating melee profiles with damage 6 strikes, or mass strength 8 and damage 2 sweep attacks plus some shooting. The Gorkanaut in particular gets more melee attacks and a +1 to hit in the war. They also have a transport capacity, have benefits from Dread Mob, and they're both in the class of units where they're big enough they could justify a mech to help them out. Giving them a +1 to hit on such a big intimidating model could well be worth it, and they might be moving forward slow enough that he could keep up to keep the buffs going and the repairs going. For weaknesses, with the damage and defense, they're still not exactly standout. Only a 3+ save without a good invulnerable save will go down really quite quickly against certain dedicated anti-tank weapons. This one's ranged output is generally a bit focused against enemy lighter infantry. and for a big slowish model where all the damage is mainly stacked to melee, they do run the risk of maybe being screened by chaff units or just kept out of the enemy's most expensive stuff for a few turns or so. That also makes the transport capacity a bit less helpful than it otherwise might have been. And even on the melee damage front, there are certain profiles that just won't take too much damage from its close combat. Things like Terminators with 2+ saves and 3 wounds might be a particularly unhelpful one. There's still a whole bunch of scary stats to wander at the enemy and something that they have to deal with, a bit of a distraction card effects perhaps. I've chosen to give the Gorkanaut a 6 out of 10. For the Morkanaut, most of those things are really quite similar. It's 15 points more, so it is a bit pricier than the Gorkanaut. Otherwise, for changes, it's more shooty orientated. It gets a 5+ invulnerable save from its force field, and rather than being mainly about killing light stuff, its range damage is a whole bunch of fairly punchy strength 9 or 10 shots with AP2 and either 3 or D6 damage. Lots of custom mega fire coming out of that, and it gets a +1 to hit in the war. Plenty of blast keywords to help it out against medium infantry, and again will be a great user of the dread mob benefits or a mech. And between all that you get a fairly scary little gun turret. For the downsides, its melee damage isn't as big, the price tag is a bit higher, and again the stats are still kind of so-so for the cost, and more so outside of Dread Mob. I've given it a 6.5 out of 10 here. I say it's the one I'd be a bit more tempted by in Dread Mob itself, which is where I'd want to use them. Outside of that though, it feels at least fairly well balanced with the Gorkanaut. Finally, we've got the really big Orky Walker. The Stomper is a great big Titanic vehicle unit. I think Games Workshop's single biggest plastic kit that they make for Warhammer 40k. A great walking dustbin covered in guns with some immense stats and an enormous chainsword. For its enormous points cost, it does have a stat line that's likely to overtax certain enemies' anti-tanks to the point where they might struggle to kill it. Most armies won't be able to put it down in a single round of shooting, though for the ones that can, that could be a big deal and a really quite quick loss for the Orks potentially. The stats are pretty hilarious. The big guns that it gets are wildly inaccurate, though have some big punchy numbers, and in melee it gets 6 attacks at strength 4, AP 5 and damage 10, or some sweeps. It does have a big transport capacity if you want to use it, and has OC 12 if it does step onto a mid-board objective, where you're going to need some fairly serious stuff to oppose it to take that point. The shooting is maybe the strongest bit if you field it in Dread Mob once again. If you stack all the best buffs on it, then its damage output does genuinely get pretty reasonable. Getting sustained or lethal hits and things from the core rule, its choice of a couple of powerful stratagems to have it shoot extra hard, and a mandatory mech for a +1 to hit. Between all that, it should be picking up multiple enemy threats per turn unless you roll poorly for it, so it should be able to make its presence felt in a more open battlefield where it can get targets, and maybe more so if it gets into melee as well. For downsides, it might be able to put out some fairly scary numbers, though the damage and defense are just really not good for its enormous points cost of 800. It really could afford to go way down. And again, it has the problem with Ork Walkers and Dread Mob, basically getting to the point of being kind of okay in that, but just dreadful elsewhere due to missing out on some absolutely enormous boosts. And it just means that no 1 points cost for it will make it fair both in Dread Mob and in other detachments. Its enormous miniature will interact poorly with tabletop ruins as well. You might not be able to set it up in certain places very well or fit through narrow gaps. That can be a problem on terrain-dense tables in 10th edition, particularly more competitive ones. In terms of balance purposes, it seems unlikely to get any sort of love from Games Workshop. Generally, it seems to be one of their more stealthy rules balance policies, that anything that's more any sort of Titan size kind of nature, so significantly above the size of more normal super heavies, just doesn't seem to get any sort of balance looking at it at all, and the Stomper might well be in that category, unfortunately. Overall, if anything, I feel like it is a bit underestimated in Dread Mob. I've given it a 4.5. I've given it a 4.5 there. In reality, maybe it could be a bit higher in Dread Mob, though likely down towards the absolute bottom of the power rankings outside that. Sticking with Titanic things, and next up we have the Gargantuan Squigoth, the last remaining Ork Forge World unit that's usable in more regular Warhammer 40k. Compared with some of the Titanic Forge World things, I feel like this one's really quite a lot more usable and costs far less points than many other armies' equivalents, 440 points. After that you get some fairly respectable defensive stats, 30 wounds at toughness 12 with a 3+ save, and then just an absolute massive melee damage, 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 3, and a crazy damage 12, or big 18 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3 to destroy some light infantry. It's got a big transport capacity if wanting to use that for 20 models in there, so you could have squads charging out of it. And any detachment that's got a focal buff or stratagem that might be able to be used on it will generally have some great value here. For its biggest downsides, the main one is just being an enormous central focal model that's got a primary melee threat and not much else. And that means that it's not going to have a good time against enemy screens and chaff units standing in the way of it and body blocking it. Be unable to get around them very well with that enormous miniature once again. As a big single centerpiece unit, it's going to be a big deal if it does get shot down too easily, and again, while it might have a lot of wounds, it's not exactly a standout durability for the points cost, due to having to pay 440 points for those wounds. Its damage output is quite fun, and I would rate it more usable than some big Titanic things. I've given it a 5.5 out of 10 here. I think in reality though, you're almost certainly going to get more value out of its weight in, say, kill rigs to transport things into battle. Finally, for all vehicle style units, there's a fortification in the Big Ed Boss Bunker. That one's 135 points, and that gives you a static fortification with 12 wounds at toughness 10 and a 3+ save. For its positives, it gets a single anti-tank shot, which is alright, and 4 big shooters. It could be a firing deck for a gunline unit, so some tank busters or looters could fire out of it potentially. It can grant cover to things behind it, so could be a more reliable way to get a cover save, though it's usually not the hardest thing to do in 10th edition. It has a leadership buffing aura, and it is quite a fun miniature. Unfortunately though, all those abilities just really aren't worth the enormous 135 point cost, and along with aircraft and Titan sized units, it's unlikely to attract any attention from the Games Workshop balance team to try and make it alright. It's immobile, unlike trucks, which could also serve as a shooting bunker if you wanted one. Trucks are enormously cheaper at 70 points as well, and battle wagons are only 25 points more if you do want a more premium option. Its damage output is particularly bad. The defense is merely okay, which is maybe the biggest weakness for a fortification when that's basically all it's got. And leadership buffs might occasionally be helpful, but really not reliably so. Overall, it feels like it's maybe one of the single weakest things out of the entire Ork army. A single one might not necessarily ruin an otherwise very strong Ork list, but it's likely to be a notable detriment compared with taking something else. Finally, let's talk through the Ork characters and bosses. We'll start out by the Warbosses led by Ghazghkull Thraka. The big green legend of Armageddon himself is 235 points. Getting a fairly chunky stat line, loads of Meganob style wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save. There's trusty banner waver Makari along, who can actually be really quite useful for keeping Gaz alive with his 2+ invulnerable save. It means that he could tank a bunch of las cannon hits or something that might have been destined to hit Ghazghkull, and that makes him a nuisance to reliably take out. Makari could get unlucky and die straight away, but could tank a fairly painful amount of damage. For his own damage output, Ghazghkull's big and threatening enough to be a big central Orky melee threat. 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage 4, or sweeping for a bunch of damage 2 hits. He gets +1 to hit and wound while leading a unit, so it usually makes sense to at least have a couple of Meganob cheerleaders, if not more. And then he gets even better than normal in the war, with all the normal boosts, but also getting critical hits on a 5+ and lethal hits in an aura for Makari, which could also help other units nearby. That's certainly helpful to have on any sort of Horde style units, like a whole bunch of chopper boys. He particularly gets on well with Warhorde for the stratagems and the sustained hits that it gives them. That works really well with his critical hits on a 5+ in the war as well. It's got a tiny bit of volume shooting, though it's kind of insignificant compared with his melee damage. For downsides, he is pretty slow at 5 inches and difficult to transport. It means he's going to have to deploy fairly front and centrally, and hopefully take up residence in a ruin in the midboard and charge out of that in the war perhaps. He's maybe a bit less reliable to be able to get into big meaty enemy targets compared with others. His damage will drop off a fair bit out of the war, and if his Meganob bodyguards are slain as well, as then he loses the +1 to hit and wound. Makari is pretty good as well, though he could be very vulnerable to things like mortal wounds if trying to take down Ghazghkull with a big focus effort. A squad throwing a grenade into the mix could near guarantee Makari gets out of the way in a single attack. Overall, he's a solid and scary option to lead a Warhorde list. I've given him an 8 out of 10 here. I certainly say he's a very powerful model, though it doesn't seem to be auto-include at the points cost that he is at the moment, usually weighed up against yet more bosses and big fighty squads in transports. Talking of the bosses though, both the standard war boss and the beast boss are really quite efficient and cheap unit leaders. The regular war boss is 75 points. He gives you +1 to hit for his unit, which is a nice buff in itself, good for knobs in particular hitting on a 4+. Absolutely fine with things like boys or breaker boys. He then has very solid damage output that goes up big style in the war. That'll mean that he's attacking with 9 attacks at strength 11, AP 2 and damage 2, plus whatever any detachment benefits or stratagems might be able to get him. It's quite nice they restore the synergy of that working after he jumps out of trucks as well, which was a big downside previously. And with that volume of melee attacks, he can threaten a bunch of wounds on the majority of things on the game, just being a bit weaker against things like toughness 12. He's also got quite good detachment synergy as well. Really central in Warhorde and good for a few of the enhancements there. Really nice in Green Tide, where you often see multiple of them leading big units of boys, and can also get double war things going on in Bully Boys too. For downsides, his damage does drop off outside of the war. It gets a lot more normal then, though I still think he's usable enough alongside the +1 to hit. He's not going to be as good at taking down the toughest things around compared with say beast bosses when he's wounding stuff on 5+s, and anything that's -1 damage like a Redemptor Dreadnought might give him a pause as well. I still say it's really quite a strong and scary unit for the points cost though. I've given him a 9 out of 10 here, and it's pretty common to see multiple in most competitive Warhorde lists. Otherwise, his Beast Boss counterpart is pretty similar value as well. He's basically a similar sort of stat lines to a regular War Boss, but 80 points, and only goes with Beast Snagger boys, so it's usually him plus 10 of those jumping out of a truck or maybe a kill rig. The big advantage of him is to have absolutely brutal damage versus vehicles and monsters. On the charge, he'll be using his Beast Chopper, 6 attacks with anti-vehicle and anti-monster, and on a 4+, those damage 2 attacks will convert to devastating wounds. And on top of that already good start, he can stack quite a lot of other buffs. Beast Snagger boys could give him reroll hits against his ideal prey. Warhorde would give him sustained hits and go off on a 5+ with a stratagem, and if you have those on the go in the turn of the war, he averages around about 10 mortal wounds or so to a monster or vehicle. So a pretty reasonable chance that between him and the rest of his units is going to kill his targets. As well as that, he also gives a +1 to hit, so his Beast Snagger boys will be hitting on a 2+. They'll be excellent against clearing out hordes with their bunches of attacks there. He's a tiny bit tougher than the regular War Boss with a 6+ feel no pain. And if you're playing the big hunt detachment, he's got access to the enhancements there, including that big +1 damage one, which is absolutely brutal against his ideal prey. Having all those attacks going off on damage 3 is just monstrous against tanks and vehicles. For downsides, he can only lead Beast Snagger boys, so has a bit less flexibility compared with the regular boss. His damage output isn't quite so impressive against heavy infantry, where the anti-keywords don't trigger, and it will drop off after the charge as he loses dev wounds. For an 80-point model though, he can absolutely punch way above his weight, and on a good roll could be just one-shotting at enemy tanks. Is maybe one of the stronger options to jump out of a transport and do that. I've given him a 9 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the snazzy armour of a war boss in Mega Armour. He's 90 points for a really quite big and tough boss, getting a 2+ save and an improved toughness characteristic and lots of wounds, and then hitting with that huge chopper at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 2. It goes to damage 3 in the war, so really quite scary attacks to be on the receiving end of there. He gives a +1 to hit for his unit, which is particularly nice for Mega Knobs as they normally hit on a 4+. A little bit of accurate shooting with that Grot Crew's big shooter, and is a central unit in the Bully Boys formation, allowing teleporting Mega Knobs with an enhancement, and just adding some more raw might to the unit. For his downsides, he's fairly pricey for an Orc character compared with some of the other ones like those regular war bosses. He doesn't really have all that many attacks. His damage is nice and general purpose, but isn't quite so standout as the war boss without the ability to go quite so crazy in the war. And his worth is somewhat locked to Mega Knobs and maybe Bully Boys too. Currently, Bully Boys Mega Knobs aren't considered one of the strongest ways to run Orcs currently, and that maybe has him be a little bit lesser placed, even if he's a reasonable strong and central unit in that detachment if you do choose to go for it. He's also got competition from the Big Mech to lead the same unit as well, and he's got some really interesting stuff including invulnerable saves and healing models, and still has some fighty damage to add in as well. Overall, I've given him a 7 out of 10. Usable enough, but kinda niche and revolving around wanting to build around Mega Knobs. Next up, we've got the Beast Boss on Squigosaur. He's 130 points for an 8 wound mounted character. Fairly chunky stats with a middling toughness, a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, and a 5+ feel no pain. I'd say they're okay for a character, though he is a very high points cost one, and is still not going to have good durability if he's left exposed. Between his damage profiles with the Beast Chopper and the Squig Jaws, he's got 9 at least fairly general purpose attacks that can have anti-keywords and devastating wounds to give them a bit more bite against punching up against stuff. It feels like most of the time he's not going to have crazy standout damage against any one target though. For his buffs for his Squiggle Boys unit, he gives them a +1 to charge and a 0 CP heroic intervention, which I describe as kind of handy but not really big central ones that you'd really think about building around. Maybe nudges of helpfulness as opposed to being something to literally buy the character in for. Maybe one of his best bonuses is being able to bear certain enhancements, particularly in the big hunt. Getting scouts 9 inches is a big deal for Squighog Boys, means that you could be having an enormous unit just pressing the enemy straight away. The -1 to wound one is pretty good for his big chunky unit as well, and will have them take a lot more firepower, and +1 damage for his own melee stats isn't bad either. If you're taking that one though, it might well be worth upgrading to Mozrog Scragbaz. Perhaps his main downside is that Squighog Boys and a big hunt aren't seen as standout efficient right now, so characters to lead them aren't quite so tempting. And as a result, outside of that, is going to be put in the sort of more usable but not crazy standout kind of category. Overall, you do create an enormous great big Death Star unit if he's leading Squighogs of any size, and particularly a bigger squad. Maybe the danger being that they just can't quite do enough with the amount of turns of damage that they can get, and somewhat at risk of being screened at or ignored if they can't reach far enough around terrain. Overall, between that, I've given him a 6.5 out of 10. I'd certainly rate higher in the big hunt though, particularly for scouts and the -1 to wound. Both of those are really nice on his unit. Otherwise, we've got his counterpart in Mozrog Scragbat. He costs more at 165 points and basically feels like an enhanced Squigosaur boss. For his perks, he gets a +1 damage on both of his base attack profiles, which is nice, a 4+ invulnerable save so it's harder to take down, and then he swaps his 2 buffs for a 4+ fight on death for his Squighog boys, and then a further +1 damage personally against monsters and vehicles, and then a big +2 against Titanics, which might not be the worst if you happen to know that there's a lot of knights out there in the meta. For downsides, he does cost 30 more points. He does trade off the slightly more peripheral buffing rules that the regular Squigosaur boss has, and maybe a big one is that he doesn't have the option to bear enhancements, so in the big hunt, no -1 to wound or scouting for his unit. Again, I feel like he's not a terrible model, just maybe not crazy standout for 165 points. Could probably do with being a little cheaper alongside the Squighog boys. I've given him a 6.5 out of 10 here. It's big, scary, and easy enough to use, but against good players, mounted units like that might struggle to get enough value out of them. Finally, for the Warboss style units, we've got the Speed Boss in the Deathkiller Wartrike. He's 80 points for a perhaps surprisingly chunky Briker profile, 9 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ save and a 5+ invulnerable. Fairly good for a fast moving character, and if you just want him to be unusually tanky, you can give him a Super Cyborg body for 15 points in the Warhorde. That gives him a 4+ feel no pain, so you have a model that's around about 100 points, but takes an unusual amount of firepower to bring down, having to slog through an average of 18 wounds at that profile. Otherwise he contributes a bit of melee damage, with a bunch of strength 10 damage to attacks, a +1 to hit if leading war bikes both for himself and the unit. It does only work in melee though. An auto advance 6 inches, which is pretty big both in the War and maybe in the Cult of Speed in particular now that you can advance and charge all the time there. And he could be a reasonable enough choice for the reactive move enhancement if you are playing that detachment. For downside, maybe having a slightly limited damage profile isn't exactly huge for him. In the context of Warbikers not having masses of melee damage, it just might not be enough to have him really carry the units to be a genuinely scary threat, and perhaps a bit of potential to be ignored. And if he does go throwing himself at the enemy unit's front lines, then he's probably not quite got the sheer amount of durability to be able to take the counter punches super well. Even if his durability isn't bad for the cost, most enemy weapons will be at least somewhat effective into that profile. Again, the Cult of Speed isn't considered one of the strong detachments. I feel like Warbikers maybe work best as smaller skirmish units rather than a big central damage dealer combo with a lead character. It's perhaps a little bit unfortunate that his damage buff doesn't help out with their shooting in a way as well. Overall though, definitely has some interest, at least somewhat sturdy, fairly fast, and some general purpose, if not super high damage. Definitely some possibilities both to running it in a Warbiker squad or running solo, maybe particularly solo with the Feel No Pain in the Warhorde. I've given him a 6.5 out of 10 overall. Next up we've got the Pain Boy, an 80 point support medic character that's really quite efficient in squads of 20 strong boys. His tender administration's giving them a 5+ Feel No Pain. That will certainly up their durability against particularly damage 1 attacks, though it does drop off a fair bit if they're shot by things like heavy bolters or anything damage 2. As durability and being tough to destroy is one of the best things that big chunky boy squads have going for them. That's really quite directly helpful to what they do, and you can also up their damage a bit by being another lurking power claw in the squad, plus having the fun Urti Syringe attack that has the chance to trigger d6 mortal wounds against some infantry on a 4+, which could genuinely help out the squad in a big way against Terminator equivalents if you get lucky with it. Once per game he also helps out by healing d3 bodyguards, a pretty reasonable chance that he'll get to use that with a big squad that he's buffing the defense of. You can add him into a unit alongside a Warboss, which is a fairly popular choice, getting an overall big, fighty and dangerous unit, and he's perhaps most standout in Green Tide in particular, where it's not uncommon to see multiple big units like that with him and a Warboss in. The similar 20 strong boy squads are pretty nice in Warhorde and potentially others as well. For his downsides, he is kind of limited to that one big squad. Just about anything else that he can join is just too small to justify his buffs, and particularly so when weighed up against something else to lead them. Even knobs don't really like it quite so much, given that they're competing against a Warboss which gives them their own inbuilt durability rule. Otherwise, he does only have 3 wounds, which means that precision is a legitimate threat to him. A bit of sniper fire or an epic challenge could solo him out, and then all of a sudden the Ork mob is far easier to kill. It's maybe not ideal for him that the 20 strong boys mobs went up in price recently. That's a direct nerf to the unit that he most wanted to buff, and maybe lessens his role a bit as a result. I think he brings solid value for his points cost though, if you're fielding him with that specific unit. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10 here. The Beast Snagger Pain Boss on the other hand feels a bit more limited. He's just got a bit of anti-synergy with his unit that just doesn't help him out too much. He's 70 points so it's a little bit cheaper, and he brings the same 5+ Feel No Pain, has the same once per game restore models rule, and has a power claw with some anti-keywords, though he doesn't get the big punchy mortal wound potential. Instead he swaps that out for healing wounds to a Beast Snagger character model nearby. He's got multiple downsides, unfortunately. It's just much worse than a beast boss for a similar cost. I feel like if you're going to choose between making the squad a touch tankier or having something that can absolutely wreck things like monsters and vehicles straight out, you're probably going to go for the latter, and you can't double up in the unit unlike the Pain Boy with regular boys. The Feel No Pain is just so much worse on Beast Snagger boys as well, as they already have a 6+ Feel No Pain, so upgrading to a 5 doesn't have the sheer value that it does on a regular boys mob. And finally, that character healing buff is just kind of weird. It would be kind of rare to have the chance to use it, as you've got to be next to a character model that's injured but not destroyed. Most of the time, if that happens, then all the rest of the unit is dead anyway. I guess occasionally it might be alright on a Mozrog Scragbad or a Squigosaur boss. They're sort of hoping that your units are going to be left half killed in a very specific way there. Overall, he doesn't have no value. You could make for an unusual unit with 20 Beast Snagger boys led by him. In reality though, I feel like if you're going for that, it's just so much more tempting to take regular boys with a Pain Boy and War Boss. It just seems like a far stronger combo overall. I've given it a 4.5 out of 10. Next up, we have the Weird Boy, a 65-point character that can be attached to boys and teleport them around the board. This already deranged Orky Psyker casts da jump on a 2+, so him and his unit can walk to anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from the enemy, maybe jumping on mid-board objectives or into the backfield if they've left gaps. He could synergize really quite well with anything that could buff charge range, maybe things like the War Horde +2 to charge stratagem, or the enhancement from the Green Tide potentially. And other than that, he can occasionally threaten a single punchy shot with a damage 5 single precision shot with Ed Banger if he's leading an undepleted mob. Very unreliable, but just occasionally might do something pretty meaningful. He has a little bit of melee contribution with that staff. He could join a mob alongside a war boss if desired, and you do have the option where you could field him entirely solo for just warping around the board doing secondary objectives if that was wanted. Though if the opponent gets any chance to shoot him, it's probably going to wind up dead really quite quickly. He might be hard to screen out though with just a single base jumping about the board. For weaknesses, he is going to fail that jump once every 6 times, which could be a big deal for his mob and could be game changing in terms of how he's going to be able to use that unit. He might not get quite such a good jump option next turn, and there's no way to guarantee a reliable charge for him. He might just have his unit just sat out completely in the open if they try and go for a brave charge and fail. His damage stats aren't particularly impressive or reliable either, though I guess that's not really the main point of him as a unit. Overall, I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Definitely some seriously interesting value, though it does come with drawbacks and not every army uses them. Definitely not terrible though, between his mix of utility and threatening a whole bunch of scary orky damage charges out of nowhere. It feels like he outcompetes the Beast Snagger Warboy in quite a big way though. He is 60 points and once again can only lead the Beast Snagger boys, and his powers are Eyes of Mork for a whole bunch of Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 2 shots. That only really gets good in a bigger squad of 20, which is kind of unusual to want to leave Beast Snaggers in the first place, and a chance to make enemy units -2 to leadership, which is a bit disappointing given that it doesn't even make them test. Overall, he's just a weak character all the way around. Battleshock mechanics can be helpful but very unreliably, and for this one you need something else to actually set up the Battleshock test, either damage or a different unit. The shooting attacks only get to be kind of okay in a 20 strong mob. You get the Beast Snagger rerolls against monsters and vehicles, but even then you're probably going to be wounding on a 5+, and again given that you can't double up on characters in the unit, he takes the place of a beast boss for the unit for a similar cost, and again you're just going to get so much more reliable value at a +1 to hit and a bunch of anti-vehicle killing attacks. As a result, he's got a seriously weak datasheet for his points cost. I've chosen to give him a 3 out of 10 here. Next we've got the mechs, and first up the regular big mech is 70 points, the fun new model with the bionic bits, the shock jump option and his fun war gear. His buffs maybe fail a bit on the peripheral side for his units. He allows you to reroll advances, and he can move through models and terrain when you do advance, and reroll ranged hits of 1. For his personal threat he does add a bit but not crazy amounts, 2 attacks at strength 12 and damage 3, plus a bit of shooting, and could be a pretty reasonable choice for adding the mech keyword to units in the Dread mob, where between that and his buffs that he can give to the squad, it could be alright there. He maybe got a bit more tempting for that kind of role after the shock attack gun mech went up in points by 10 recently. The custom Mega Blaster isn't quite as scary, but not as far behind as you might expect. For downsides, just for the 70 points, all of his buffs and benefits just seem a little on the peripheral side. Rerolling advance rolls is definitely a nice enough advantage for units when you might be in the war and advance and charging, but again something that you could use a command point for and it might not be necessary. Range rerolls are a slightly weak buff for most of the squads that he can lead, not unhelpful for tank busters I suppose though. The damage profiles are merely okay at range and melee, and again Dread mob being usable but not standout doesn't help him there. He also does face competition from the other mechs as well, particularly the shock attack gun for leading ranged units. I've seen people use them in competitive lists from time to time, though maybe a bit sparingly. I've given him a 6 out of 10 here. Maybe alright if wanting to do Dread Mob Tank Buster combos or things like that. I don't think he brings quite enough outside of that detachment though, with adding the mech keyword. For the other on foot option, there's the big mech with a shock attack gun, 85 points for a big worry portal of death that fires snotlings. It's got D6+1, strength 9, AP4 and damage D6 shot, which only hits on a 5+, but can have a bunch of other buffs, re-rolling hits of 1, the heavy keyword, a once per game re-roll of the shots. He could gain some detachment bonuses from Tactical Brigade or Dread Mob, and he could use the datasheet rules for looters or tank busters, both of which could have them hit their targets much better. As mentioned, he'll also grant the mech keyword for Dread Mob, which would be pretty meaningful for the shooting buffs for looters or tank busters. Again, like much of the Orc shooting, outside of detachments that can make him hit significantly harder, is going to be really weak. You certainly not really want to be using him in Warhorde inefficient lists. It's kind of limited to Tactical Brigade or Dread Mob, or maybe more Dakar if you still want to try and make the Bad Moon one work. He's had some big points nerfs recently as well. Both he went up 10 points, and both looters and tank busters also rose as well, which was really not great for him. Its own damage output, while you might be able to stack a bunch of things quite high on it, it is still always going to be very swingy, both with multiple d6s to roll and also being inaccurate, and it certainly won't do much to anything that's toughness 10 or higher without some good support. For the detachments that he's strongest in, I've given him a 7 out of 10 here. I'd rate him way below this though in detachments that don't buff his shooting. Next up, we've got the Mega Armoured Mech. He is 90 points, and like the Mega Armoured Warboss, he's got a much more intimidating stat line, a 2+ save and some Power Claw or Kill Saw attacks. For most armies, he's a durability enhancement for Mega Knobs. He gives them a 4+ invulnerable save at range. He can put one back on its feet per turn, and that's pretty reasonable given that they've got good stat lines, and with their feel no pain type thing, they might well have their unit survive partly intact. The Grot Oiler can also heal a unit once per game. They contribute a bit of threat with a Power Claw or Kill Saw and have some shooting threat on top of that. They grant reroll ones to hit at shooting as well, which could help out a tiny bit if you're taking some combi weapons along, though it's not exactly huge, and gives the mech keyword for Dread Mob. Perhaps the single scariest use of him though could be to be a mech captain in the Tactical Brigade. That enhancement allows him to join flash kits, and that'll allow him to give them the 4+ invulnerable save and revive a model, which is kind of unusual, and then just have some enormous damage output between the Orky orders and then full rerolls to hit with a whole bunch of strength 6 and damage 2. For downsides for him, I'd say he requires to build around a full unit of Mega Knobs to make use of those durability benefits, otherwise probably not worth it. I find Mega Knob leading the overall combos probably far more viable than Bully Boys versus elsewhere. Gasgol or the Warboss could be good competition for him as well. I'd say 90 points feels kind of fair for his abilities, though maybe not priced super standout or auto-include. And the Mech Captain went up to 45 points for the enhancement, and big flash kit squads also cost more now. Overall, I've chosen to give him a 7 out of 10 for his abilities. I think he's usable enough if you are wanting to use Mega Knobs. They're probably a little bit better in Tactical with that enhancement. Finally for the mechs, we have the standard one. He's 45 points for the actual vehicle support mech, acting as the Orky Tech Marine, getting a lone operative next to vehicle style units, and then healing units for D3 wounds and giving them +1 to hit at the same time. It means that if you've got any of the Titanic Orky units, so Gorkanauts, Morkanauts or Stompers, then he's going to be tempting. He maybe could be alright as well on things like battle wagons with a whole bunch of things firing out the top of them. And like the rest of the Orky shooting units, he's going to be far more interesting in Dread Mob that also gives big advantages to those shooting walkers and makes them overall more viable. If you are using a Titanic walker in those though, I'd say that he's near enough auto-include. Healing D3 wounds and a +1 to hit is pretty excellent value for 45 points, and he should be able to hopefully do that multiple turns in a row. In theory, you could also use him to lead a squad as well and grant it the mech keyword there, if remaining points wouldn't allow you to stretch to a big mech for some reason. I'd say that's a fallback option though, and if you're using that for a mech keyword, you might as well have the big mech to add a bit more reasonable stuff to the squad. Overall, it's good for the cost if you are using those, though they aren't considered to be super meta or anything right now. Again, having his value tied to a couple of datasheets that are fairly pricey and detachment specific. I'd overall say that take one if you're using a Stomper, and pretty reasonable to take one alongside a Gorkanaut or Morkanaut, but otherwise likely not worth it. I've given him a 7 out of 10. Next up, we've got the sneaky Orky lone operative that is Boss Snickrot, 95 points for the leader of the Red Skull Commandos, and brings a bunch of interesting stuff here. He's the only outright Orky lone operative in the Codex, and they're generally handy enough to have in Warhammer 40k for screening out sections of the board, and being a unit that the opponent just can't interact with at long range. He's got a once per game redeploy so he can teleport across the board and do a secondary objective or threaten somewhere unusual potentially. And it's kind of handy that that teleport doesn't have to happen until after you've drawn your secondary objectives, so you could see if there's something worth him going after. He's also got Infiltrate as well, and is the single cheapest Orc Infiltrator unit, as Commandos cost 120 points, and that could have some draw as well. In theory, if all you want to do is screen out one section of the board from enemy infiltrators, then he can do that to a great big 18-inch diameter radius. That will kind of put him at harm's way though, unless you can find him somewhere safe to hide. If you wanted to, he can join commandos to make them more threatening, and also give them the benefit of cover as well. And when he skirmishes with the enemy, he hits with a bunch of Strength 6, AP 1 and Damage 2 attacks with Twin Links, a profile that's pretty likely to cause at least a few saves on the enemy, though with low AP, they're not super reliable either at killing big stuff or necessarily killing characters despite precision. I'd say his main downsides are not really all that much damage, maybe a bit pricey for the sort of utility lone operative style role that he might be going for. If the enemy catches up with him, then he's not got a ton of defense despite having the stealth keyword, and he feels really quite dependent on getting good use out of mission rules and utility. He's definitely usable enough though. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. For competitive lists, he seems to make the cut in some, but probably not the majority. Finally, we've got the big haired runt herd that is Zodgrod Wartsnagger. The deranged runt herd and his super runts are 90 points to have the character to lead the unit, and in general he'll be going with an 80-point Gretchen unit, so 170 points for him and 20 Gretchen models and 2 runt herds. They all gain scouts 9 inches to take up some threatening positions and be a nuisance unit in the midboard. He does at least a pretty reasonable job of making them just that bit tougher and more threatening, giving them all a +1 to hit and wound, and then also making them -1 to wound as well. It's still not going to make them standout damage dealers or anything like that, but they can skirmish surprisingly hard against things that are say toughness 4 and weakish saves. The +1 to wound also works on him and the runt herd profiles as well, and it's quite nice for his strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 attacks. Kind of funny that he basically hits as hard as an Adeptus Custodes. During the war, as well as the usual benefits and the 5+ invulnerable save that his super runts will enjoy, he also gets a bonus 6 inch to the movement characteristic of models in his units. That could have them rocket across the board a pretty crazy amount, and maybe be a big turn of move blocking and gumming up the enemy, which could be kind of big to pin back a lot of squads and stop them from impacting the game. For downside, is still not necessarily going to do all that much damage with Gretchen profiles besides against light stuff, and maybe tends to act a bit more like a pricey utility speed bump that can gum up a primary for a turn or so. And recently his run of doing his own personal turn 1 war in Mordaka was cut short when the stratagem got put up to 2 command points. Overall, I feel like his combined combos may be in the region of being usable but not standout, and again, like Snickrot does get play in competitive lists, though not all of them. Overall, I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. That just about brings us to the end of our look through the Ork army though. Let me know your thoughts as to the units down in the comments below. Which ones are you getting good use out of at the moment, and would you rate any higher or lower than I have here? Before we go, I'll just circle back to the video sponsor in Tabletop Tech and their Mechi carry cases. I mentioned them earlier in the video. Basically one of the more unique ways out there of transporting miniatures around the board, a bunch of small grippy components to hold models in place, basically as an alternative to magnetic transport. They ship out worldwide from Australia and have an Auspex code for 10% off if you pick anything up. They're linked down in the video description. For some possible pros and cons with them, I feel like they might work a little bit better for more small and stable collections that are likely to stay the same for a good while, as that means that you wouldn't have to change up the loadouts for the cases all that regularly. Maybe combat patrols, kill teams and spearheads seem pretty ideal for them. Apparently, according to them themselves, their big 2,000 point style cases are also some of their very most popular as well. I feel like the cases look good and feel fairly satisfying to use. I was sent one myself to play with, and no major complaints or issues from me. They do have the small benefit of not needing to mount magnets on bases, so saving a tiny bit of hobby work potentially. For a few possible downsides and drawbacks, they could be a little bit less speedy to get things in and out of compared with some due to having to operate each simple component when you do. Maybe just a tiny bit on the over-engineered side here, even if it's well made, and it's not maybe quite as flexible once set up. You can absolutely swap every part out, though if you have things added to your army with different size bases, you might need different components to grip onto them. Obviously there's loads of other 40k transport systems out there, which will have their own pros and cons. In any case, for their range they've got a bunch of different designs, these more standard slider case ones, with varying sizes and maybe a focus a little bit more on the transport than display. Their biggest, most central and more flexible option are their slider case frames, where you can have various different configurations for different shelves and stacker modules and things, and these can be configured to fit most standard size armies. Their 12 style ones might be for bigger collections. They've got these 6 style ones that can fit any combat patrol in it. As mentioned, they've got some pretty enormous ones that can fit full 2,000 point armies, and here's the example of them set up to take some Crimson Fists. Here's a few of my own miniatures testing out the modules and all being held in place very snugly. And if you want a bit of guidance as to the various different modules and options they have, they've got a live web store chat feature where I'm sure they'll be more than happy to give you a bit of advice as to how to configure any one case for your given collection. They've got lots more stuff as well, including their award-winning Duncan Rhodes hobby case. That one's a particular popular one. and they've got some light up display features as well if you wanted to mount them on walls. A big thank you to them for sponsoring the video though. You can check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look at their stuff. I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, then Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.